Lecture 11. Pope Urban II calls the First Crusade.
Welcome back. In our last lecture, we saw how a moment of crisis in the life of one man, Peter Abelard, deeply influenced the development of medieval theology, philosophy, and scholasticism. Centuries later, Abelard's attempt to join reason and logic with religion would serve as an inspiration for those who wished to do the same in the early modern period. We saw, too, how the fact of Abelard's castration had a dramatic impact on his lover and wife, Eloise, bringing her and her lively intellect and wit to the attention of both medieval and modern scholars and thinkers, when she might otherwise have gone unremarked and unnoted by history. We see through Eloise's writings the glimpse of a world of possibility for women. She, like Abelard, loved argumentation, disputation, and the examples of the past, especially ancient Greek and Roman writers, to guide her as she staked her own theoretical ground. The stories and accomplishments of Abelard and Eloise would profoundly impact people at all levels of society in the years to come, as thinking about religion, philosophy, and romantic love became more and more front and center in the cultural consciousness of all inhabitants of the medieval world. Today we're going to see how the logic and rhetoric so beloved of both Abelard and Eloise could be used for vastly different ends, cleverly twisted to appeal to a particular vision of the past. Now, it will come as no surprise to any of you that the past I'm speaking of here is that of the Roman Empire, which is invoked repeatedly throughout the Middle Ages by all sorts of people in vastly different cultural settings across broad geographic regions. Today we're going to explore how an idea of that past, plus appeals to the particular contemporary concerns of the day, were given voice in 1095 when Pope Urban II called upon Christians to take up arms and reclaim the Holy Land. It might seem at first that this moment is one of those turning points in history that arise because of the will of a single individual, as we can actually point to the man who gave voice to the idea that Europeans should take up arms and head east in a religious venture. But this isn't really the case. While Urban was the one who made the speech in 1095, his call happened because of a series of factors that all seem to collide at exactly the same moment to produce the perfect situation for that call to resonate with huge segments of the population. Certain social issues, combined with demographic pressures, religious concerns, and economic matters, all came together to produce a scenario in which it seemed logical for a farmer to put down his hoe, a merchant to close up his shop, and a knight to abandon his manor, and for all of them to travel for months to a foreign country to do battle with an enemy who wasn't even looking for a fight in the first place. Unlike the Great Schism of 1054, that had almost no impact on the majority of the medieval population at the time of its occurrence, the calling of the First Crusade is one of those turning points that both had an immediate impact and had an impact that was felt on all levels of society. The average person was affected by Urban's call as much, if not more, than the nobles and church leaders to whom he officially addressed his plea, a fact that is demonstrated by the grassroots, overly enthusiastic and uncoordinated responses which led to events known as the Peasants' and Children's Crusades. In particular, these two attempts to take back the Holy Land were notable for their inclusion of quote-unquote average people, as well as their dismal failure. Most of the participants either turned back, died along the way, or even worse, were sold into slavery. In order to understand what produced this situation and how it was that Pope Urban came to make his remarkable plea to a gathering of churchmen and nobles in Clermont in 1095, we will need to remember some of the other turning points we've already discussed and look ahead a bit to some that we'll discuss at greater length later in this course. Many people have tried to explain what it was that inspired some 50 to 70,000 men to leave family and friends, incur enormous expenses, endure brutal hardship, and march toward Jerusalem in 1098, when the first official waves of Crusaders set out. Some scholars have argued for what we might call the keep 'em busy theory, which holds quite simply that in a society founded on violence, if there wasn't any outside enemy to combat, people would quickly turn on their allies and comrades, and chaos would result. So sending a large portion of the fighting classes off to engage an enemy outside of medieval Europe would theoretically help keep the peace at home. Another theory, what we might call the second son theory, holds that because of the widespread implementation of the system of primogeniture throughout the medieval world by the 11th century, younger sons found themselves with dim future prospects, and they saw the trip to the Levant as a chance to establish name, titles, and wealth unavailable to them back home. Yet another theoretical position argues that a kind of religious fervor was sweeping through the land, and it was in a kind of mass hysteria that the first wave of Crusaders set off on their mission. In truth, it was most likely for all of these reasons and more. More significantly, it was because these multiple factors were all coincidentally in play at the same time. Urban's call was in some ways an organic and even predictable response to what was happening in the medieval world at the time, but it's a true turning point in that it pointed and focused all of those energies and concerns in a specific direction. As we will see, sending a huge segment of the population into the East was the solution to a lot of problems, but it created some new ones as well. As you'll remember from Lecture 8, the schism between the Western Latin Church and the Eastern Orthodox one was a turning point that no one really recognized for what it was at the time, and it didn't affect the day-to-day lives of people much at all. While the officials at the top of the hierarchy had excommunicated each other, ordinary folks continued with the practices that had been in place for many, many years. It was only with the benefit of hindsight, a few decades on, that more people began to feel the rift between the two branches of Christianity, and also to recognize that the dream of reuniting and restoring the former glory of the Roman Empire was quickly fading, as the two former halves of that empire continued to move in opposite directions from one another. Still, hope remained, and in 1095, the Byzantine emperor, his borders continually threatened by Turks, sent an envoy to the west to ask for Pope Urban to help round up soldiers who would be willing to serve in the emperor's army and fight off this new enemy. Urban saw this as a golden opportunity to try and heal the religious breach through secular means. If men from the West rescued the East, then good relations could be restored, and perhaps the rift could be mended. He may even have had the idea that the Roman Empire could be made whole once more, at least in a religious sense, and that perhaps that religious unity would then have an impact on the political world, and finally, the empire itself could be restored to something like its former glory. And when this happened, he surely thought, the city of Rome, home of the Pope, would be the center of the world. According to Fulcher of Chartres, it was just a few months after receiving the Byzantine emperor's letter that Urban made his plea, and he made it by appealing first of all to the common past of the East and of the West, emphasizing the common ground between the peoples in that they were both Christians while the attackers were not. Now, although the Turks were not attacking out of religious conviction, Urban chose to characterize it that way, stating, quote, "Your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised them. The Turks and Arabs have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians. They have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire." End quote. He goes on to tell of men forcibly circumcised, of people murdered by having their entrails ripped out, tied to a stake, and then being made to walk forward until by their own motion they are fully eviscerated. It is better, Urban goes on to say, that I don't even start to tell you how they treat the Christian women. This titillating cataloging of atrocities, plus an appeal to common religious sympathy, was a clever ploy. But Urban went so far as to claim that Christ himself commanded that Western European Christians take up arms in the conflict. Even more significant is the way that Urban identifies particular groups of potential fighters, and also the way he identifies the rewards that those who participate will receive. Quote, "All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins." End quote. Now, this was no small thing in a world where the fear of hell was an ever-present concern, and the belief in purgatory was a constant check on immoral behavior. It was believed that even among those who would eventually go to heaven, some time in purgatory to atone for venial sins was pretty much a foregone conclusion. It was also believed that friends and families of the dead could speed the time a soul spent in purgatory through prayer and donations to the church, especially donations earmarked for the saying of special masses for the deceased. With his announcement in the calling of the First Crusade, Urban offered a way out of purgatory for your everyday sinner and salvation for even those who had committed much graver, even mortal, sins. In fact, just in case there might be any confusion on the matter, Urban then singled out groups of potential conscripts. According to Fulcher, Urban said, quote, "Let those who have been accustomed to wage unjust private warfare against the faithful now go against the infidels and end with victory this war which should have been begun long ago. Let those who for a long time have been robbers now become knights. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. Let those who have been wearing themselves out in both body and soul now work for a double honor." End quote. You can see the appeal. In one fell swoop, Urban offered social advancement for those seemingly locked in place in the hierarchy, respectability for those who had previously engaged in less than respectable activities, and salvation for all. It was a perfectly pitched statement designed to reach and appeal to the greatest number of people in the medieval world possible. As you may remember from our lecture on the Battle of Lechfeld, that event was significant at least in part because of the way that Otto of Germany had used heavy cavalry, heavily armored men on horseback able to ride down their enemy because of the combination of technologies like the high-back saddle and stirrup. In the aftermath of Lechfeld, more and more leaders began to take this approach to fighting, as it was spectacularly effective. Some scholars have gone so far as to suggest that Lechfeld helped to create feudal society, in that maintaining power now was dependent upon a leader's ability to call on men to fight for him, and, specifically, to call on men with horse, armor, swords, and lances. By 1095, that meant that there was a warrior class that needed to be maintained, and there were soldiers for hire who would be willing to fight for whomever paid the highest sum. And as warriors, these men would have done their fair share of killing. Even if this killing was in a just cause, it would have meant some time in purgatory after death. William the Conqueror, for example, was most concerned about this, which is one reason why, after the conquest of 1066, he ceded almost a quarter of England's land to the church and himself ordered and paid for the construction of various religious houses. Such moves were meant to reduce the time he would have to spend in purgatory. But now, Urban had just solved this fact of medieval life by asserting that full remission of sins would be granted, and it wasn't even necessary that the sinners in question be successful in their endeavor. If they died on the way, and I should note here, many of them did, then it was straight to heaven. Just for declaring their intent and setting off. Disease, drowning, starvation, the three most common causes of death among crusaders, were now gateways to a better afterlife. It is no wonder that many career soldiers, raised to be warriors, saw this as an opportunity to do what they did best and then get a double reward, wealth and riches in land and titles in life, a straight line to heaven in death. Another social issue that Urban's call tapped into was the recent explosion in population. Starting around the year 950, the climate in Europe changed, warming up by a degree or so. This might not seem like much, but it was just enough of a change to have a real impact on medieval life, one that we'll talk about at greater length in Lecture 18. Growing seasons lengthened. Winters were shorter and milder. The upshot of this was that more food was produced, which in turn provided better nourishment to the population, and more children thus survived into adulthood, and then the cycle repeated. Between the years of 1000 and 1300, the population of Europe doubled, with scholars guesstimating that by 1300 there were 75 to 80 million people living in the medieval world. The first effects of this population growth were definitely starting to be felt by the end of the 11th century. With most countries practicing primogeniture, this left a sizable chunk of younger sons looking for a calling. For most, that meant the church, but there were plenty who did not want to go that route. The excursion to the Holy Land and the possibility of claiming titles and land there had to have been appealing to this portion of the population. The growth of a warrior class and the entrenchment of what some scholars refer to as feudal society has further implications in terms of understanding why Urban's speech at Clermont met with such enthusiastic response. This social structure was based on a system of hierarchy and loyalty, and it was built like a pyramid. At the top were kings and princes to whom the nobles of the land owed loyalty. These people were known as a ruler's vassals. The vassals themselves would have vassals, lower-ranking nobles who had sworn fealty to the men above them in status, and so on down the line, with peasants and serfs at the bottom. Another way to think of this social order is in terms of the three estates ideal of medieval society. This theory, which was becoming fixed in the popular consciousness at around this time, held that there were three orders, or estates: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work, also known as everyone else. The idea was that for society to function, each estate had to keep to itself and be the best it could be. So, a knight, for example, should never try to farm. That was not his job. His job was to protect farmers and the church. Churchmen should not fight. Again, that job was for knights. And farmers shouldn't presume to be knights. They should keep laboring the best they could in order to support the other two estates. So far, so good. But if we break the estates down by percentages, we see that the nobles and clergy combined made up about 10% of medieval society. The everyone else was 90% of the medieval world. It was an unbalanced social structure, to say the least. But Urban's speech seemed to offer the possibility for inclusion where exclusion had been the norm. According to Fulcher, he urged robbers to become knights. According to another witness, Urban's definition of who was eligible to go was fascinating for the way it allowed people from all walks of life, all social structures, and all genders to participate. One eyewitness reports that Urban dictated that, quote, "No women shall go without their husbands, or brothers, or proper companions," end quote. A statement most remarkable for the fact that it clearly seems to anticipate that women, and plenty of them, will be going along for this adventure. Urban goes on to say, quote, "Let the rich aid the poor and equip them for fighting and take them with them," end quote. Something that opens up the possibility for those below the rank of noble and with no military equipment to speak of to join in. He continues, quote, "Clergymen shall not go without the consent of their bishop," end quote, a statement that allows even as it limits on the surface. Clergy were not forbidden, they just needed to get permission. And indeed, one of the most amazing things to come out of the calling of the First Crusade is the establishment of religious orders that were also military in nature. Orders like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller would come to be the first monastic orders to have a specifically military component and duty. So at exactly the time Urban is making his appeal, we have a population boom, a growing warrior class who fight and kill for a living, a large population within that class who, as younger sons, have few prospects, a large segment of the population accustomed to being relegated to the lower ranks, and a rift with the Eastern Orthodox Church. All of these factors in combination meant that Urban was strongly motivated to issue the call, and also that there was a sizable population eager to hear what he had to say and to follow his instructions. But none of these things would have produced the significant response to Urban's call had it not been for another element that helped bind all of these together and give them a degree of power they otherwise would not have had. This element is religious faith. As I suggested earlier, the remission of sins and direct entrance into heaven was clearly a motivating factor that made Urban's speech so well received. In a world as imbued with religion as the medieval world was, who wouldn't want to hedge their bets against purgatory and damnation? But apart from this, there seems to have been developing at this time a two-pronged movement that was sweeping through medieval society. As I noted earlier, this was a growth in religious fervor that was coupled with an accompanying, persecuting mentality. For a long time, the causes behind the Crusades were viewed cynically by many. Personal gain, escape to a better life, all of these might have been reasons to take up arms. But sincere religious belief? Hardly likely. Urban's call, with its carefully described and circumscribed audience, its appeal to emotion, and its catalog of horrors visited upon Christians in the East, almost every single one in exaggeration, has long been read as an artfully constructed performance that had as its ultimate goal the rejoining of the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire. If cities and countries sacred to Christianity could be wrested from Muslim control along the way, well then, that was a bonus, or so many have tended to think. More recently, however, scholars have seen that it seems more and more as if sincere devotion to the faith did motivate a large proportion of the Crusaders. It was expensive to go on crusade, and we have records of many nobles taking out loans, selling off lands, and going to great lengths to raise sufficient funds for the journey. And the records indicate that it was not just younger sons who participated, but eldest children and even heads of households. While they cannot have fully appreciated the horrors that awaited them on the journey, among them starvation, disease, and even cannibalism, they also must have been well aware that this was not going to be a pleasure cruise. A sincere commitment to the faith and a desire to heed the directives of its spokesman on earth, the Pope in Rome, is part of what motivated many medieval European Christians to take up arms and fight a series of wars thousands of miles from their homeland. This rise in religious fervor seems to coincide with an increase in what scholar R.I. Moore first identified as a, quote, persecuting society, end quote. From the middle of the 10th century on, we see in Europe a growing intolerance. We'll discuss the causes and most serious impact of this in a later lecture on the persecution of the Jews, but for our purposes at the moment, it is simply important to note that at the time of Urban's speech, we are a century and a half into a social movement that encouraged the persecution of Jews, Muslims, heretics, homosexuals, lepers, and the few remaining pagans in medieval Europe. We have moved well into the time that I like to call everyone pick a monotheism, and in this time, tolerance for those whose belief differed from one's own, or were outside of the social mainstream, was at an all-time low. Thus, when Urban identifies Muslims and Turks as persecutors of Christians, the appeal he makes would have been in keeping with the promotion of a xenophobia and persecuting mentality that was gaining traction throughout the medieval world. We can see this combination of religious fervor and persecutory zeal in the makeup of the first waves of crusaders that headed east. This first group, often called the Peasants' Crusade, left almost immediately after Urban had made his call, and their leaders, Peter the Hermit and another man named Walter, seem to have easily gathered an army of common folk enthusiastic about the prospect of killing infidels. Somewhat surprisingly, this contingent made it to the Holy Land, although in greatly reduced numbers. Another officially sanctioned group that left at approximately the same time got stuck in the Rhineland, where apparently they decided that the large communities of Jews living there were a suitable target for their crusading zeal, and they either executed or forcibly converted huge numbers of Jews before church officials managed to rein the crusaders in. But still, the waves of crusaders kept coming, impelled in part by a reminder and a warning from church officials. If a man had vowed to take the cross, as it was called, he needed to keep that vow and get himself to the Holy Land. Two more large waves of Europeans headed to the Middle East during this time at the very end of the 11th century. Against almost everyone's expectations, including their own, it seems, the surviving crusading forces managed to capture Jerusalem in July of 1099, along with some surrounding territories, then establishing 4 Christian realms in the midst of a Muslim sea: the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the County of Tripoli. There, younger sons, and some older ones, deeply religious men and women, and more than a few opportunists, found a new life that in many respects was so much better than what they had left behind in Europe. Minor nobles from France could become kings and dukes, and those who settled in Outremer, as it was called, were exposed to philosophies, art, architecture, scientific advancements, and cultural customs previously unknown to them. The Crusader leaders also discovered that in order to survive there, they would need to learn to coexist with the Muslim, Jewish, and original Christian inhabitants. Once on the ground, they found that coercion and control weren't going to be as effective as it might have seemed back in Clermont in 1095. This produced a situation that in some respects was not unlike what had happened in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. But the leaders of the Muslim world weren't going to forget, and some of the Crusaders' own leaders seemed intent on undermining any peace that any Christian leader attempted to secure. Reynald of Châtillon, for example, lord of the fortress of Carac, regularly attacked Muslim pilgrim convoys full of innocent non-combatants in what seems to have been a perverse desire to prolong hostilities. The actions of him and a few others were a constant source of consternation and exasperation for other leaders who, after 2 centuries of coexisting with their former sworn enemies, sought to establish more harmonious relationships between the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities. Most frustrated of these was King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, one of the more sympathetic figures in history, a man who tried to rein in Reynald of Châtillon, who had an intelligent mind, and who died far too young, terribly disfigured by leprosy. The actions of men like Reynald eventually provoked the great Muslim warrior, poet, and philosopher Saladin to take firm and decisive action against the Crusaders. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin's forces dealt the crusading forces a blow from which they would never recover, and which spelled the beginning of the end for the Christian European presence in the Levant. Join us next time as we explore the significant occurrence in East-West and Muslim-Christian relations.